Now, we had over years been fighting against what they call sometimes segregations. And we had been fighting against individual laws which were very oppressive. Going back to the Act of Union, now there's the whole pile of those laws, the worst of which came during the decade of the 20s. But here and there would be reason to hope. When Jan Hofmeyr, for instance, became the Minister of Education, roundabout towards the end of the Second World War, he did something which had not been done, and that is to allow the funding of African education to come from the treasury, as distinct from the poll tax which had been deposited before. And now, during that election campaign, D.F. Malan shouts, apartheid, apartheid, keep them apart, put the kefirs where they should be. And it was after the Second World War. I was one of those who opposed the recruitment of Africans to serve in the Second World War. I lost. Now, and we lost a lot of people in that war, as we did in the First World War. And we got nothing out of it. But there was still hope. And Smuts, who was the minister, the prime minister at the time, appoints the Havenha Commission to consider the question of the past laws as a result of campaigns we mounted against the past laws round about the middle 40s. And Malan, we wake up one morning, we are told that Malan has won the election. And that meant that he shut the door on our faces. That hope which had been raised by the actions of Hofmeyr as Minister of Education, by the Havenha report on the past laws, that hope was extinguished, and we faced D.F. Malan on his apartheid policies, and doors were closed to progress. By 1907, it had become quite clear that both the Boer and the Britons were agreeing to form one government over the whole of South Africa, but on the understanding that the Africans would be kept out of the franchise. And so, therefore, 1909, you get the National Convention by the whites. But in 1909, also the Africans form a convention, as a result of which they sent a delegation to England to persuade the British government not to sign the Act of Union, which then was a bill. And one important feature of that is that a decision was taken that there was to be a committee which would continue to be in existence after 1909, which was led by Walter Govan. And so the Union of South Africa was formed, and the Africans were kept out of it. And those in the Cape, that means for the franchise in the Cape, the door was left ajar to get rid of it at some stage. And so they did in 1936, and that door was closed. And then by 1912, or from 1910, the Africans were canvassing amongst themselves the formation of an organization which they regarded as a parliament for Africans, in contrast to the parliament which had been formed by the whites in 1910. And so the African National Congress was formed. Now, this was an act of dispossession. The act was, in fact, finalizing a process that had already taken place, because at the end of the wars of dispossession, the Africans had been driven back into the areas where by 1910 they were, and where today they are as Bantustans. They had already been driven back into those areas. And then in 1913, the government legalizes what already was the position in practice. And it had been led during the period between 1910 and 1913. All political parties, white political parties in the country, were agreed on this. And the main argument that was used was that of squatting by Africans on what they regarded, the whites regarded as white areas. Now, and those farmers who allowed Africans to operate as farmers in the white areas were said to be farming Kafirs. That's what's the history of South Africa. So this campaign was whipped up by the whites must remember that by 1912, JBM Herzog is Minister of Native Affairs. And he is trying to pilot this bill. Ultimately, he didn't pilot it. Someone else piloted it through Parliament. And it is that law is coupled to two other laws which were passed in 1911, Native Labor Regulation Act and the Mines and Works Act. Now, this trilogy of legislation fixed what ultimately became the parameters of segregation and ultimately apartheid. Amongst the peasantry at the time, there was talk of landlessness. And it was obvious. And I mean, even as a youngster, I saw it myself. And I saw in practice how the Glen Grey Act worked. I didn't know it came from the Glen Grey Act, but I saw the practice of it. That in the surveyed areas of the Transkei, the heir to that family was the only one who could have arable land, so that the other 3 or 4 sons had to find a way of living. And invariably, they went out to work. And this also links up with the migrant labor system. They were forced to go out to seek work outside the reserves. But then the law made it impossible for them to settle where they were working. It pushed them back. And another argument which now flowed out of this process was that the mining and the mining magnates had to rope in economists to write up the theory of the migrant labor process. And they developed a theory. And I'm surprised that this never received much attention. It developed a theory of the backward labor supply curve, meaning that if you gave workers more money by way of wages, then they would be at the place of work for short periods of time and go back to the reserves to rest. Now, and this argument was used by the economists who were employed by the mining magnates, and even by economists at universities, because it had become traditional to accept that sort of argument to justify the low wages on the mines. It's all linked up with landlessness, with the shortage of land. It was before there were the African townships like Soweto. I used to live in town with my sister in city and suburban in Johannesburg. You should know that. Now, And those days, there was prohibition of liquor amongst the Africans. And there were the pass laws. And where we lived, there would be a cottage, this street, that street, and sort of back-to-back arrangement of houses facing that street and facing this street. And then there would be a passage, what the Africans call a gang, in between those. And the police would close one end of this and close the other end of that and start searching the houses there. Beat up people. And I mean beat them up for no reason other than that they were there. And arrested people. And these were the conditions in which we lived. They forced their way into where you were. And in those conditions, we had one room. I was living with my sister and a cousin, and it was one room. And that was what everybody's experience was. And we were angry. You came out on the street, even though we lived in town. By 11 o'clock, the police would shine a torch on your face and demand a pass. If you didn't have a pass, of course you went to jail. Now, these were the conditions on which we lived. And when I listened to people like Vabaza and like Sulope Temba talking about those conditions and addressing us and telling us that here was the organization to which you should be belonging as Africans, there was no problem for me.